win. Unbelievable scenes here at the Bull Ring. India, the world champions.
Why does India always end up on the wrong side in rain affected matches versus New Zealand? Why did it take New Zealand almost 100 years of their test playing history to finally win a series in India? Did you know back in 1969, India was the beneficiary of heavens raining down on Hyderabad? New Zealand had almost pulled off the unthinkable if not for a cloudburst.
Join us as we look back at a series that was highlighted by riots in the ground, groundsmen who forgot to cut the grass from the pitch, and a downpour that denied the Kiwis what could have been their first triumph on Indian soil.
Hello and welcome. Here we are again, myself Suresh and my co-host Abhinav, to the latest episode of the Reverse Sweep Show. How's it going, AB?
As always, Suyash, all good. Still recovering from the painful loss that we just had against New Zealand after 12 long years. We are losing the first series in home. That still stinks, and I'm still recovering from that. How about you?
Yeah, it's very difficult to come to terms with it. We always feel with this Indian team that something will turn, somebody will stand up, but this time nothing of that sort happened. And at this rate, I'm not even surprised if we are going to be blanked 3-0. So it's that kind of a week that as Indian cricket fans, especially with Indian team playing at home, we are always under that confidence that we are going to find a way. Doesn't seem like that and gives a lot of worry before the BGT starts. Uh, but yeah, there were elements of rain involved. There were elements of toss involved as well. And it's not the first time that we are seeing all this, right? Between India and New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to India New Zealand matches and rains, it's like a wishful kid inside of me that keeps asking this question: that why does India always find itself at the wrong end of a rain impacted match? Or whether it be the 2019 Cricket World Cup semi-final, the World Test Championship final, or the first test of this series.
But this is what we have been researching in the last 1 week, that this isn't the first time that rain has played a part, and this isn't the first time that New Zealand came close to winning a Test series in India. Back in 1969, it was actually New Zealand who were at the receiving end of rain, and they were agonizingly close to winning a historic Test series in India, and then they wouldn't have lived with the burden of 60 years, 70 years of not having one in India.
Exactly. Did you just tell our viewers the topic of today's discussion is?
Absolutely. This is what we are going to discuss. We are going to revisit that 1969 series when New Zealand came to our shores, played really well. It was a tightly fought series. It finished 1-1, but it should have been 2-1 to New Zealand. We look back at a lot of hypotheticals that could have arrived specifically from third test, which had riots, cloudburst, a lot of ill-timed pitch changes that were done. So we are going to go through all that, and we always follow a certain structure to these kind of things. If people would have looked at our earlier episode, which is episode 2, which we will link in our show notes, AB, how are we going to go about it?
Yeah, so important for our viewers to know a broad structure so they can follow us. Like the second last episode that we did, we'll first look at the macro context. We'll look at where was New Zealand cricket in its overall evolution leading into that test series. Where was Indian cricket in the overall evolution? We'll talk about some key players involved in that particular series and in the specific match that we'll be talking about. And then, after having said that, we talk in a bit more detail about the specific events that unfolded, which led to the draw. And then we go into the meat of the discussion. We discuss all the what if scenarios, what could have happened, right? So we'll be breaking this discussion into three parts. Now, having said that, let's jump into the macro context. And SS, I know you have been researching a lot about New Zealand cricket back in the days. So over to you.
Yeah, that has been what keeping me awake during the weeknights, going through over what has been the past of New Zealand cricket. And specifically looking at what happened post World War II, it was the kind of dark ages for New Zealand cricket. They were the whipping boys, so to speak, whenever they came up against top teams. They had scores of 46 and 54 and all that with against Australia. So that they did not play versus Australia till 1973.
And a fun fact around that, it wasn't considered a test match back in the time, and ICC retrospectively gave it the status of a test match. And as it can be expected, New Zealand players who participated in that match did not appreciate this move. Also, the second point that you mentioned, Australia and New Zealand didn't play a test match for a long time. And funnily enough, it was because New Zealand Cricket Council did not give them a good allowance for touring New Zealand.
Yeah, so New Zealand
Yeah,
were not only the whipping boys on the ground, but they were laughing stock when it came off the field as well. But it
exactly.
kind of led to a point where, as domestic structure became better, there were players getting exposed to better training. 60s and 70s became the respectable era for New Zealand cricket. Uh, they would go on to lose most of the test matches and series they played against top nations like England and West Indies. But when it came to playing against South Africa, India, and Pakistan, they would generally win a test match here and there, compete very well, but would still be on the losing side more often than not.
Yes.
Uh, they played a lot of series in 1960, so there's a lot of cricket being played, but only in the 1969 year that they came up and shown, which by playing a tough series versus India at home, for India, 1-1, and then they went to Pakistan to win. But this was also the time that some stars were being born in New Zealand cricket. John Reid and Glenn Turner as a two very good ones, but we will talk more about the other ones. Uh, but the I think you were more into the Richard Hadley research, that it was Richard Hadley that gave
Yeah.
a lot of impetus to New Zealand cricket.
Yeah, when we talk about New Zealand cricket, I like to think you started it. You said that post-war they were in the Middle Ages, dark Middle Ages. I feel when Richard Hadley came in, that was kind of their evolution phase, and 60s were a decade of initial evolution where that period of growth started for New Zealand cricket, and then they built a team around Richard Hadley in the 70s, leading up to their golden era in the 80s where they performed really well. But to that extent, 60s is like that initial evolution phase for New Zealand, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they were solid professionals. Of course, there were a lot of cricketers that were coming from playing different sports like rugby. So there was a sense of professionalism that was creeping in, that was also being shown on the pitch when they were playing. So they were becoming a tougher nut to crack going into the 70s, but you would still back them to lose whenever they travel, specifically when they travel to Asia. But what about our Indian team setup going into the 60s?
Yeah, 60s was actually a very interesting decade for Indian cricket. This was a time when we actually learned how to win at the big stage, right? There were a few important wins that we had. The first win against England, when England toured India, we had that. The first Test series win against England, that happened in the 60s. Uh, then again, when India toured New Zealand, we won the first series abroad. That was against New Zealand. So a lot of firsts that were happening. We had a very enigmatic captain in the Nawab of Pataudi. We had some really good players coming up. The spin quartet, we had Ajit Wadekar. So a lot was happening in Indian cricket. But when we look at it towards the end of 60s, we were reaching a point where we were starting to see the performances dip. And as we know, we were reaching a point of some seismic shift in Indian cricket, where Pataudi would get ousted from captaincy, Wadekar would come in, and then in 70s we have some big stars coming in: Sunil Gavaskar, Gundappa Vishwanath, Kapil Dev later on, and this all culminates into the World Cup win in '83. I think that's the pinnacle of that era that we see. But a lot of that foundation happens in the late 60s, right? Because of the changes that happened in Indian cricket.
Yeah, Coming back to the India New Zealand series, I mean, if you look at the precursor events, India had toured New Zealand and won a series 3-1, which was like monumental thing, India winning a test series away. And you would feel that coming into 1969 series, you would back the Indians to do well and probably win a series in against New Zealand. Uh, I think it's a good moment that we go into discussing what happened during the series, and we can go test match by test match. The pitches were, of course, spin friendly, and it was the month of October, so there was a late summer and a lot of heat involved. So toss was becoming very important. And in the first couple of test matches, India and New Zealand exchanged. In the first test match, India won by 60 runs. Uh, there's a lot of hit and trial of new players during that point of time. Vijay Merchant was the chief selector. He was trying a lot of players. So we had Ajit Pai debuting as a fast bowler. You had Ashok Mankad, the son of Vinu Mankad, also coming in, and Chetan Chauhan as the opener. Uh, One of the big takeaways from that match was that New Zealand were competing, but when it goes to day four, day five, the Indian spinners were coming more in the four. So Prasanna and Bedi were doing very well, but it was also that selectors would look at somewhat like umpire Venkat, as we know, Srinivas Venkat Raghavan to come in as a third spinner. And the other shift that we saw from first to second test match was that India decided that none of that pace uh, to be given to the New Zealand bowlers. We would New Zealand batsmen. We would rely on our all rounders to provide that medium pace, which is very interesting because that became like the blueprint for Indian teams to come in the next 15 years, which even has some kind of impression to even this date. That was the first test match. And if you look at the second test match, the roles kind of reversed. This time New Zealand won the toss. It was played in Nagpur, and New Zealand were able to restrict India and got a lead of 50 runs through first innings, and they went on to win by 167 runs, in which three spinners wreaked havoc on India. Uh, the guy named Howard picked 9 wickets, but there were a couple of right arm off break medium bowlers who did part time stuff but picked a lot of wickets, which reminds a lot about Mitchell Santner. And this is where the parallels just start being in
You
place with this series.
you just pressed a painful nerve there, SS, by talking about Myth Santner.
Yeah, but
Yeah, let's.
this is where it happened that Indians were relying on spin. They were spinning wickets, but whoever wins the toss would bat first, and then the spinners would impress upon. The batting was of ordinary quality from India and also from New Zealand. But if you look at the total statistics of the series, New Zealand batters did outperform Indian batters in terms of aggregate runs made by the top three batters. But this is where you felt that New Zealand were being smart about, because when it came to the third test match, they decided to include a fast bowler in, and this is where the meat of our discussion will happen, because third test match is where the hypotheticals come into play. Uh, in the third test match, which happened in Hyderabad, there was a lot of rain, and there were also riots in the city and riots in and around the stadium because of various events. New Zealand started, made 181, and they were all out after having a very big opening partnership. Again, as ever, Prasanna and Bedi did all the work. Prasanna took a fifer. India had a miserable response to that. And one of the reasons is that in those days, all the test matches had a rest day. And the rule was that you need to cut the grass off the pitch whenever there's a rest day. You cannot do that on a playing day, and this was a miss by the umpires and the referees and the
Groundsman.
management committee of the stadium. And when they realized the mistake, it was a third playing morning, and the New Zealand captain Dowling, who had a big role in this series as a leader, said no to this, that this cannot happen. And India had to basically play on a green wicket, which reminds of our Chinna Swami thing that happened in the first test match of this series. India were 50 for 9, and apparently a young boy came out running, right?
After the amazing partnership for
Yeah.
the 10th wicket, 40-run partnership, there was a young boy who came running to congratulate the batters.
Yeah, and this was the point of where another loss of time happened, because we had already lost time on day one because of the rain. There was some more time lost because of this incident in which the young boy was hurt by the police when they were trying to uh, stop him and escort him out, and the riot broke out. And eventually, India folded for 89, relinquishing almost a 92 run lead to New Zealand. And New Zealand, knowing that time would be of essence in this test match, made 175 and declared with the loss of 8 wickets to set up a steep target for India. And this is where the fun began. Day 4, day 5, India just couldn't keep up with the pace bowling because there was a lot of still assistance in offer. The elder brother of Richard Hadley, lesser known, uh, the older Hadley picked 4 wickets in the first innings and 3 wickets in the second innings. He finished with 13 wickets in the series, and India were reduced to 76 for 7 when a cloudburst happened. The fun part of about this cloudburst is uh, that when it did stop, because cloudbursts are like short-lived rain that happens like very quickly, and the drainage systems aren't that great during that point of time. Uh, the ground staff were deliberately slow. Nobody knows
Yeah,
if they were being paid to do that. And
exactly.
apparently, you found out that a certain New Zealand player came on the pitch to help them out.
And I also want to read out an article from Wisden for all our listeners. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So the article on Wisden says over 2.25 hours of playing time remained when the rain clouds burst, and there was very heavy fall for half an hour, followed by hot sunshine. No real effort was made to get play started again. Instead of the covers being removed, a few workers with rags, some of them women, were given the task of removing the water from the covers. And although there were official denials later, it looked very much like a deliberate go slow policy. For perhaps the first time in cricket history, a test captain, Dowling, was on the field in bare feet, helping to remove the water. The match was abandoned 20 minutes before time, and this brought another demonstration by the crowd.
Wow. And we were thinking, wow, why Rohit Sharma isn't doing that at Green Park versus Bangladesh? He should have been out there
Exactly.
as well. Would have been
Barefooted.
better than his batting contribution. Because of that slowness on the part of the ground staff, almost 2.5 or 3 hours of play was lost, and the play couldn't basically begin. And India was 76 for 7, and New Zealand came agonizingly close. And if I believe half an hour of play would have happened, New Zealand would have been able to wrap up the Indian tail and would have gone back with a historic 2-1 series win over India in India.
And just to set the context, just to amplify on the importance of the series win, New Zealand had not won a single test series in their entire history till then. If they would have won, it would have been their first series win in their entire test cricket history and first series win abroad. And that too in a condition that is very alien to them.
Yeah, kudos to them and kudos to Dowling as well that they did not uh, it did not give a massive setback to them from a mindset perspective, because a few months down the line they were in Pakistan and they won a test series there, but they lived on with the burden of not having won a test series in India for that long because of the
The
things that
cloudburst.
unfolded on the in the fifth on in the third test match in Hyderabad.
True. So, as is now that we have discussed the macro context, should we move into the meat of the discussion? Should we get into the what if?
Yeah, I think the biggest what if is around the amount of time that was lost in the third test match, because the first two test matches were result oriented, and the third test match had the biggest disruption because of rain, and there were also riots. Um, and so the biggest what if is that what if that time wasn't lost? Would there would have been a result, and what it could have led to in terms of impact for both teams?
Honestly, if you ask me if there was enough time, I would say that New Zealand would have gone on to win the match. The reason I say that is because throughout the series, I feel that New Zealand were able to outbat India. Number one. Second, they were able to play the conditions well. So if the conditions was offering something for the pacers, they would exploit that. Something for the spinners, New Zealand will be able to exploit that. So for those reasons, I feel New Zealand would have gone on to win the test match and hence the series, which means they would have won their first series in test cricket history, first series in India. What do you think is what would have happened?
Yeah, completely agree with you. Given the slow nature of progress in test matches, then if you compare, the test matches progressed at a rapid pace because the New Zealanders knew that time was of the premium, and it shows that when their bowlers uh, had the ball in their hand, whether it's fast bowlers or spinners, they were able to do a job on the Indians, because Indians were not batting really well in this test series, specifically in the third test match, and whoever won the toss kind of dominated because they would choose the batting first, get some runs on the board, and then use their spinners and fast bowlers depending on the conditions to lay the pressure. So, given the amount of game time that was lost, um, if even half of that would have been recuperated, I think within 1 hour, Indian team would have folded. New Zealand would have won the series, gained a lot of confidence from there.
Um, Totally agree with you. I think both our analysis of the what if situation is pointing towards the same thing, a New Zealand series win. But then a question to you, SS, what would the impact have been on New Zealand cricket overall? What's your take on that? Mid-term, short-term, long-term? How do you think it would have changed New Zealand cricket?
I mean, on the general side of things, the respectability would have definitely beefed up even more. Um, they would have been respected when they toured. They would have gotten much more frequent tours uh,
Hmm.
as well, and played more occasionally with Australia, as we've kind of hinted at earlier. Also, in terms of players, they had top players, but then players like Howard and Hadley, the older brother, I mean, who got 13 wickets in this series, they would have gotten better professional contracts, maybe in the county championships in England, because that's where all the top players were going and competing and learning the trade, and that would have allowed them to upskill themselves, get a better pay as well, elongated their careers, and in totality, this would have just increased New Zealand's confidence. And they might have performed well in the inaugural World Cups as well, because when I read about players like John Reid, um, who was considered to be one of the best all rounders, if he would have kept himself fit, New Zealand would have been a better team in those early World Cups as well in ODI cricket.
Yeah, I agree with you. And in fact, my take on this is on the similar lines as you. A few points that I want to talk about. And I think when I was researching about this, these were the kind of points that really stood out for me. If I look at stats, in the 60s, New Zealand played 13 series and they just won one series. And that was the series against Pakistan right after India. Had New
Yeah,
Zealand won the series against India, they could have actually doubled their series win, right? So they would have
absolutely.
won two series. And the ripple effect, if I talk about that, 70s, they actually again went on to win just one series. I feel had they won the series in India, they would have been crowned as the subcontinent conquerors. They would have been riding high on momentum. They would have probably propelled the development of cricket domestically. And I feel their golden era would have been preponed. So instead of it developing in the 80s, they would have been
Yeah.
able to reach that point somewhere in the mid 70s. And
Yeah, and also I think these kind of have ripple effects in terms of the board getting better avenues to advertising and sponsorships and better training camps and everything. So it has some tangible and intangible effects, all these kind of things. I mean, look at Indian example, 1983 has a lot of tangible but a lot of intangible help as well. And maybe, just maybe, they would not have to wait till 2024 to again win a test series in India.
yeah, absolutely. In fact, the point that you mentioned, my big hot take on that is when the game went through that evolution of T20 cricket and domestic franchisees and league cricket, I think New Zealand would have been better prepared to leverage that and really become a much stronger board, even financially. So, my hot take is if New Zealand were able to prepone their golden era into mid 70s, they might have been a part of the big three cricket boards right now. They would have been in the leagues of India, Australia, and England right now. And also, on a side note, another thing, the trans Tasmanian rivalry would have been a lot spicier even back in the 70s.
Yeah, I agree on the second point. I mean, Australia and New Zealand would have competed far more often. I think the I think in 2000s they started playing very regular ODI cricket between the two nations, but I think top level cricket between the two nations would have been more frequent if New Zealand would have been more successful, even though I feel Australia would have always had an upper hand on them. Uh, I don't quite agree with the big three bold approach because I feel India, Australia, England would have anyways uh, kind of reached to that where we are right now. And I believe Pakistan with a large market, and if things were geopolitically better for them, they would have anyways been the pseudo number four. But New Zealand would have competed really well with South Africa and Sri Lanka, and maybe and most likely would have been better than them. They would be like the number five for me.
Yeah, I mean, I know we are doing a podcast on what ifs, but by throwing Pakistan into the mix, you have just enlarged that bucket of what ifs. Pakistan is such a big what if, right?
Yeah, yeah. Pakistan is yeah. Entire existence of Pakistan is what if.
Okay, let's not go
We will leave at
down
that. We
there
will leave
more.
at that.
We'll
Yeah,
leave
we
at
will leave
that.
at that.
Let's get closer to home. Assess what would have happened to Indian cricket had we lost that series against New Zealand.
I mean, in a way, couple of months down the line, we were beaten badly by Australia 3-1 at home. So that was like the mirror that was shown. Things would have been expedited in terms of some players being brought into the team. We had already doubled down on the spin first approach in India, which was successful one and which would have anyways been the case. But I believe some of the team selections that happened in the 1969 series, that players like Chetan Chauhan and Ashok Mankad were brought in for the first test match and then slowly phased out, and then they were brought back later on for the Australia series. Uh, if we would have lost that, then those kind of experimentations, one-off experimentations, would have been lesser in number, giving a lot of comfort and confidence to the Indian team. Uh, but in the mid to long run, I feel whatever transpired because of some underlying characteristics of Indian talent pool and the growth of the game in the country. So the victories of 71 in West Indies and England would still have happened. Um, but I think the biggest impact would have been on the change in captaincy between Pataudi and Wadekar.
I again on most of the points I'm totally thinking on the same lines. A few things that I want to add. If I look at the overall performance of the Indian Test cricket team in the 60s, we played 12 series, we won 3 series. The first series that we won was against England at home. That was the first time we won against England. That was one of the firsts that we talked about earlier in the episode. Then the next series that we won was when New Zealand came to India in 64. The third series that we won was when we visited New Zealand. So basically, India at that time would have thought that New Zealand is someone that they consistently defeat. And when New Zealand
Yeah.
is touring India again in home conditions, we expect to beat them every single time. So India would have started as heavy favorites, and losing to New Zealand, as you said, would have shown a big mirror to the entire management. There would have been some really strong questions that would have been raised around the batting that India has. Spin, of course, everyone understood across the world is a strength that India has. Another big question would have been around the captaincy. Now, when it comes to captaincy, we should definitely talk about Vadekar versus Pataudi. So, any initial thoughts on that? Assess Vadekar versus Pataudi,
I
different
think
captaincy
initial thought that
styles.
Pataudi was like a natural leader coming from his birth and coming from his Oxford days, and had captained India for a long time and successfully at home. But it seemed that he had there was a loss in momentum, so to speak. This was, if we look at a modern example, is like Dhoni losing series away in England and Australia, despite being a natural leader, because at some point of time you are as good as the team around yourself, and so it needed some shaking up. Uh, Ajit Wardekar was a very different kind of leader in terms of more strategically planned and man of few words. But you needed kind of that reject, and probably these are the kind of series defeats. Sometimes it's very inexplicable as a fan that why is the captain being removed when he did not played too badly after a series defeat. It's like accountability. And the accountability over here would have been on Patodi, specifically with the Australia uh, coming to India. And that is what in reality transpired as well in 1.5 years or something when India went abroad for tours. Vadekar was anyways the captain, so that would have been expedited. And he would have had success like he had in a natural order. So Patodi had
What do
his
you
run.
think? What do you think would have happened to the India versus Australia series right after the New Zealand loss? If India would have
I
lost.
don't think there was enough time between the two test series and the kind of changes that Vadekar wanted to have bring in, whether in terms of personnel or otherwise, would not. I mean, Kundappa Vishwanath did play that series and made some runs, so he would have anyways played. But Gavaskar was a couple of years away. Chandrasekhar wasn't around. I don't think he played that series. And Ashley Mallet, who DK used to call Ashwin as Ashley, wreaked havoc, and he would have still done so. So I don't think India would have been able to um, catch up with Australia in that series, and I think the result was fair and wouldn't have changed. Maybe a test match here and there might be, but that is my prediction. I think it would have still been 3-1 to Australia.
For me, this is the one place where I differ from your opinion. Is this the last time Australia toured India in the middle of the decade? It was a drawn series. If I remember the scoreline correct, it was 2-2 draw. And I feel India back then was a pretty good team, and the problems that they had probably were around the decision making. They weren't able to read the conditions properly, were making the wrong team combination choices. So, of course, after a defeat to New Zealand in home, uh, the captaincy change would have been the next thing for the management to do. Wadekar coming in as a captain, changing a few things here and there. I think India would have given Australia a very stiff competition. Maybe Gavaskar would have been fast tracked into the team. So my prediction is India wins the series against Australia 2-1 instead of losing it
Mm.
1-3.
No, interesting.
So that
And
is my
and and
prediction.
and what is your midterm take? Do you think that India would have still gone on ahead and played good series in West Indies and England and gone through the 70s with the spin quartet ruling? Would those things would have stood?
Yeah, I think all those things would have stood up. The only thing that would have changed for India is the test series against Australia. India still goes to West Indies, England, wins all those series, then defeats England in India, and all under Ajit Wadekar's captaincy. I actually read an article on Crick Info which said that Wadekar was like an island in the sea of Fatodi. I think
Hmm.
after this, Wadekar would just have been a bigger island, so he would have gotten more credit for whatever he did with captaincy. But long term, we would have all those stars: Gavaskar coming in, the spin quartet performing well, Kapil Dev coming in. I think everything else stays the same for India, just that the mirror show for India would have been a bit quicker.
And maybe if we go by your hypothesis that India would have won a series in Australia, probably that would have closed the doors for Patodi even 6 years later, because I read that Vadekar played his first test match under Patodi's captaincy, and Patodi came back in 75-76, became the captain, and Vadekar played his last test match under him. Probably in your universe, Patodi had would have had enough in terms of management ties and would have never come back in the team because
Yeah,
Vadekar would have such a long rope.
true, that could have happened. I mean, that could have definitely happened. Now that we have spoken also about a few of these key players, like we spoke about Patodi, we spoke about Wadekar, any specific players that you think whose careers, whose legacies would have been very different compared to what they are right now?
I mean, if we look at least from the Indian team setup, Vadekar and Patodi were both 28, 29 when that series happened. And the Indian spinners were, let's say, very early on. I think Bedi was 23, Prasanna was pretty young as well. If they would have lost the series at home, uh, that would have dented their confidence. But they would know that they would get a lot of backing because they're the premier spinners in India and would have done continue to do a great job for Indian team. I don't think their legacy would have been defined by an India New Zealand series. So it would have been more on the management level as well as the captain level. Uh, Certain players might have had a different look about them in terms of their utility to the Indian team. Uh, but more or less, the players that we know about or idolize, they would have still continued to remain very important for the Indian team going in the future.
Hmm. Interesting. Because one more point that comes to my mind is Indians, we all know, are such passionate cricket fans, right? And whenever India loses a high profile match or a match that India is supposed to win, the reaction is always negative until probably the very recent past, when they have gotten a bit more educated about the exact happenings of the sport, how things work. We saw that in 23 World Cup, India lost at home, but the fans did not give that negative reaction. I still feel that the team would have gotten a lot of backlash from the fans, because back then they didn't even have TV, right? So for a normal common man out there at work or at home, the only exposure they have to cricket is through radio, or if they have the chance of watching it in the match, or watching the match live. So for them, I think it would have been a heartbreaking moment, India losing to New Zealand at home, and they would have given a lot of backlash to the team.
Absolutely. They would have an impact on the batters even more because they were the ones that were not putting up the runs. There were some changes already done for the Australia series. Chetan Chauhan was brought in, Ashok Mankad was brought in again. Uh, I still believe that the plethora of changes the selection committee was anyways doing with series on series would have still continued. Uh, don't think they would have an impact on the legacy. It would have really dented their confidence for sure. And maybe if if they lost the versus New Zealand, there would have been an impact in terms of getting tours and getting teams to come over as well, because you need a competitive home team to come, and they would have lost the mojo of winning a lot of series in India as well. But at least my hypothesis is that nothing of that sort happens, and India continues to dominate because it was already a big market of cricket. Uh, Cricket was anyways being in the big centers. A lot of play skill centers had come up, and a lot of players would have continued to ply their trade. So I don't think there would have been a lot of impact from that perspective. But in terms of Philip to the New Zealand team, yes, there were a lot of cricketers that we talked about would have really grown in stature worldwide.
I actually, in fact, want to talk about Graham Dowling, the captain of the New Zealand team that time. He captained New Zealand in 19 tests across 68 and 72. Uh, and he had a very interesting dynamic with the Indian team. The first test he captained was when India was touring New Zealand, and he scored a mammoth double century. But New Zealand still went on to lose the test series against India. So when he was coming to India, winning a test series in India against India would have been a massive up for him. It have been a big deal for him. And in fact, throughout his career, like specifically in '69, some key matches, when West Indies came to New Zealand, they ended up losing the series against West Indies. Then New Zealand went to England, they again lost the series without winning a match. Then New Zealand came to India, that series was drawn, and then New Zealand went to Pakistan, they won that one series. So from the perspective of Graham Dowling's legacy, I think winning that series in India would have been a complete change. He would have massively increased the legacy that he leaves behind. Because shortly after that, his career was marred with injuries, and he didn't play after 72. So I think for Graham Dowling, winning that series would have been a big thing.
Nice. So there you have it, guys. We have done in terms of hypothesizing what could have happened. So AB, I give you 30 seconds to share your summary of what ifs from both India and New Zealand perspective.
Thanks for the pressure, SS. 30 seconds. I feel, given everything that we researched about that series, India would have lost the series if there was no cloudburst, which would have meant a temporary dent in Indian cricket, massive changes in team management, leaderships, different strategies. I feel India could have won that series at home against Australia shortly after. And then India goes on to win all those epic series abroad against West Indies, England under Wadakar's captaincy. And then India has all these superstars, Sunil Gavaskar, Kapil Dev, who bring Indian cricket forward. When it comes to New Zealand cricket, I think it would have had massive impact on them. They would have propelled the evolution of cricket in New Zealand, their golden era would have been preponed by at least 5, 6 years, which I feel would have had further ripple effects in the present. They would have been better suited, better prepared to exploit their conditions in the world cricket when T20 cricket came in. They would have been a much stronger board right now, probably in the leagues of the big three right now. So that's my take. Over to you, SS. 30 seconds.
Uh, so India, of course, loses the test match and the test series. A lot of backlash from media, and some of the management and leadership changes would have been expedited, but they would not have been timely. India would still lose to Australia in the home series. Um, but in mid to long term, because of the underlying robustness of growth of cricket in India, India would have still achieved the heights whenever it achieved heights in 70s, and would still produce the good players that it produced. As for New Zealand, a bigger fillip, they would have the confidence when they always came to subcontinent going forward. Uh, some of the stars would have got bigger contracts to play domestic cricket in, let's say, England. That would have enhanced their own skill set, enhanced the game back in the country. And New Zealand would have become a more tougher team to play against, more respectable, and would have probably been like the fifth country in terms of in terms of the pyramid of world cricket. All right, guys. So this was today's episode on looking back on that famous series when New Zealand came to our shores and gave us a big run for our money and should have won the Test series. We publish every Monday and we are on all podcasting platforms. All the relevant links are in the show notes. And we hope to see you again in next week and spread the word.